Hey guys, in this video, we're going to talk about respiratory substrates. So, first of all, let's define it. A respiratory substrate is something that is going to be used in an organism. So it's going to be broken down in an organism in order to release energy, which will then be used by the organism. Now, we have three different types of respiratory substrates. So, we have carbohydrates, we also have lipids, and finally proteins. And what do we call the process in which a nutrient is broken down in an organism to release energy to be used by the organism? That's right, cellular respiration. So we're still in the context of cellular respiration. Now, although we have these three different types of potential respiratory substrates, the body usually prefers carbohydrates to lipids, and so it will use carbohydrates first. If there are no more carbohydrates, then it will use lipids. And then, if we don't have carbohydrates or lipids to use, it will use proteins. So, let's do this. Now that we know that carbohydrates is the most preferred, you'll remember that in the case of glucose, it goes through the 4 steps, right? So it goes through glycolysis, then pyruvate oxidation, the citric acid cycle, and finally oxidative phosphorylation. So it goes through all 4 steps of cellular respiration. Now, if we were to have, let's say, glycogen, or let's say cellulose, in this case, since these are multiple sugars, right, attached to each other, they're polysaccharides, right? That's the technical word. They're polysaccharides, and not one or monosaccharide as that of a glucose. In this case, we will have to, first of all, break down the polysaccharides into monosaccharides like glucose, and then we can proceed to go through the process of cellular respiration. All of them, that is. So that was carbohydrates. Now let's talk about lipids. So in the case of lipids, first of all, it's going to be broken down into fatty acids and second, glycerol. Now, these two things go through different steps of cellular respiration. So, in the case of fatty acids, it will actually be broken down into acetyl coenzyme A. Then it will go through the citric acid cycle, And finally, it will go through oxidative phosphorylation. There is no need for this fatty acid to go through glycolysis or pyruvate oxidation because it has been broken down into acyl coenzyme A. In the case of glycerol, it's going to be converted into a middle product. In the context of glycolysis. And so it's going to complete the glycolysis, then go through all 3 steps. So all 4 steps. You could call it 3.5 steps, right? Because it goes through the last 3 steps, 1, 2, 3, and it goes through part of glycolysis. Finally, we have protein. So protein is going to be, first of all, broken down into its component parts, which are amino acids. And this amino acid is then going to go through deamination, which is something we talked about in the last video, where we lose an amino group. So then we will have a regular old organic acid. Then this organic acid is going to be converted into either pyruvic acid, or it's going to be converted into acetyl coenzyme A, or it could also be converted into a middle product of the citric acid cycle. And then it will go through, so it could go through pyruvate oxidation, or it could enter in the middle of the citric acid cycle, and it would both go through oxidative phosphorylation. So now that we see it this way, it's a little bit hard to follow. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a chart. Let's just use different feature. So we're just going to clear the page there. And so if we were to draw that again, we could say that, let's say this is proteins in red, and blue is carbohydrates, and finally black is lipids. And the 4 steps, you'll recall, of cellular respiration were glycolysis, and then we had pyruvate oxidation, then we had the citric acid cycle, and finally we have the oxidative phosphorylation part. And what's going to happen is, well, carbohydrates, if they're a monosaccharide, let's use the original color. If it's a monosaccharide, it will go through all parts. And if it is a polysaccharide, then it will have to be broken down to monosaccharide first. In the case of amino acids, well, we know that proteins will have to be broken down to, in the case of proteins, it has to be broken down into amino acids first. Then it will lose an amino group, and it can either enter here as pyruvic acid, or it could enter here as acetyl coenzyme A, or it could just go in the middle product as a middle product of the citric acid cycle. By the way, this amino group is going to become ammonia as it is taken out. Remember that the amino group is NH2, so it's probably going to combine with another hydrogen atom, and it's going to become ammonia. And in the case of the body, remember, ammonia, where is it? Well, it's in, yep, that's right, when we pee. Anyways, to get back here, finally we have lipids. And so in the case of lipids, we remember it breaks down into glycerol and fatty acids. And glycerol, it'll go in as a middle product of glycolysis. And it will go all the way down. So it will go through all the cycles. Well, part of glycolysis with it, that is. And in the case of fatty acids, it will turn into acetyl coenzyme A. Then it will go through the citric acid cycle, oxyphosphorylation, and finally we will produce ATP. A lot here, of course, but there will also be ATP produced in them as well. For example, during the citric acid cycle. That's it, guys. That is the video, or a summary of respiratory substrates in the context of cellular respiration. And I also showed you depending on what type of molecule that is proteins, carbohydrates, or lipids. Thanks, guys, and I'll see you guys in the next video. In the next video, we'll talk about why fats or lipids are more effective in storing energy than carbs. Thanks, guys.